I'm holding the missing poster in my hands as I record this, and the date printed across the bottom is 3 weeks before I ever set foot in this place. My face is on it. Not someone who looks like me. Me. The photograph is the one from my employee file, the one I never gave to anyone except the people who hired me, and it's been laminated, the corners rounded the way the machine rounds them, and someone has stamped it twice in purple ink. I found it inside a cabin that was padlocked from the outside, a padlock that hadn't been opened by the dust on it in longer than I've been alive. I want you to understand that before I say anything else, because everything I tell you after this is going to sound like the words of a man who lost his mind alone in the woods. Maybe I did. But the poster is real, and I have it here, and that is the one thing I can't explain away, no matter how badly I want to. So let me start from the beginning, while I still remember it the way it happened. While I'm still sure it happened to me and not to someone whose name I borrowed. I took the job because I needed to disappear, and they were offering a place to do it. That's the honest version. The cleaner version, the one I told the few people who asked, was that I needed the money, and that part was true too. I had co-signed a loan 2 years earlier for a business that wasn't mine, a favor for someone I trusted, and when it collapsed, it took my savings and my credit and a good portion of my dignity with it. I was working 2 jobs in a city that cost more than I made, sleeping maybe 5 hours a night, and the debt didn't move. It just sat there, growing slowly, like something breathing in the next room. When I saw the listing for a seasonal relief ranger at a place called Hollow Reach, in a basin so far back in the reserve that the nearest town was a 4-hour drive, I almost didn't apply. I had no real experience. I'd done trail maintenance one summer in my 20s, and that was it. But the listing said experience preferred, not required, and it paid more than it should have for the work, and it included lodging, which meant for the length of the contract I wouldn't be paying rent on an apartment I was barely living in anyway. I expected an interview. I expected someone to ask me why a man with my background wanted to spend a season alone in a glacial valley with no cell signal and a radio that only reached one relay tower. Nobody asked. I filled out a form online, and 4 days later, I got an email with my name already on a duty roster, a start date, and directions that ended with the words, "The last 6 miles are unmarked. Follow the fire road until it stops." There was no signature on the email. The sender was listed only as field operations. I told myself that was normal for an underfunded agency running a place nobody wanted to staff. I told myself a lot of things in those days that I no longer believe. The truth I didn't say out loud, the truth I'm only saying now because there's no one left to hide it from, is that I wanted to go somewhere I couldn't be reached. I wanted to be a man who, for a few months, simply was not where anyone could find him. I had reasons for that, and the biggest reason was my brother. His name was Theo. He was 4 years younger than me, and 18 months before I drove out to Hollow Reach, he walked into the backcountry on a day hike and never came back. They searched for 11 days. They found his car at the trailhead, and a single trekking pole half a mile up the path and nothing else. No body, no campsite, no sign of where he turned off the trail, or why. The case stayed open the way those cases stay open, which is to say it sat in a drawer and stopped being looked at, and after a while people stopped saying his name around me because they could see what it did to my face. Here is the part I never told anyone. I was supposed to be on that hike. We had planned it for weeks, and the night before, I picked up an overtime shift because the debt was the debt and I needed the hours, and I texted Theo that I couldn't make it. He went alone. If I had been there, I have spent 18 months telling myself I would have seen which way he went. I would have been a witness. There would have been someone who could stand in front of the searchers and say, "He turned off here. Look here. He can't have gone far." Instead, there was nothing. He vanished into a silence so complete it was as if he had never existed at all, and the worst thing, the thing I have never been able to set down, is that some small and rotten part of me was relieved. We had been fighting. Our mother had died the year before and left us her house, and Theo wanted to sell it, and I wanted to keep it, and the fight had grown into something ugly that touched everything else between us. When he disappeared, the fight disappeared with him. The house was mine, and no one would argue. And in the middle of my grief, underneath it, there was this thin, cold thread of relief, and I have hated myself for it every single day since. So when I drove out to Hollow Reach, part of me was running from the debt, and part of me was running from the city, but the deepest part of me was a man who already half believed he deserved to be erased, and who had found a job that would let him practice it. The fire road was exactly as bad as the email promised. The last 6 miles took me almost an hour, the truck crawling over washouts and roots, the trees closing in until the sky was just a gray ribbon overhead. Then the road simply stopped at a clearing, and there were the two cabins. The main cabin was small and solid, dark logs gone silver with age, a stovepipe, a single window with real glass. There was a covered porch with a bench and a coffee can sitting on it, and inside the coffee can, when I checked, was a ring of keys and a note in pencil that said keys to everything, logs on the desk, radio at 3, sorry I couldn't stay for handoff. It was signed E. Adler, that was the ranger I was relieving. I had been told he was rotating out and that our schedules wouldn't overlap, which struck me as strange even then, because every job I'd ever had made a point of overlapping the person leaving with the person arriving so nothing got lost. But I was tired from the drive and the light was going, so I took the keys and the note and went inside. The main cabin was clean in the way that places get clean when one person lives in them carefully for a long time. A wood stove, a narrow bed, a desk with a logbook, a kitchen counter with a 2-burner propane range, shelves of canned food and dry goods. A radio set bolted to the wall with a handwritten card taped above it that read, "Relay check-in nightly 3:14, confirm status." There was a back room I'd find later, an annex, but that first night I didn't explore. I lit the stove, ate from a can, and looked at the logbook just long enough to see that the last entry was 3 days old, in a tight, cramped hand, and said only routine, nothing to report, and then below it, in the same hand but somehow looser, like the writer's grip had loosened, all good here. That was the last thing E. Adler wrote. The second cabin was the thing I couldn't stop looking at through the window. It sat maybe 40 feet from the main one, the same dark logs, but its single window had been papered over from the inside, and across the door was a heavy hasp with a padlock the size of my fist. The strange part, the part I noticed that first night and filed away as someone else's eccentricity, was that the padlock was on the outside. You don't lock a storage shed from the outside and then paper the windows from the inside. You can't. Someone had papered those windows and then someone had locked the door behind them, and the geometry of that didn't sit right, but I was exhausted, and I told myself it was a maintenance shed, and that I'd look at it in daylight, and I went to bed. At 3:14 the morning, the radio woke me with a click and a low hum, and a woman's voice said, "Hollow Reach, this is Relay, confirming check-in." I stumbled to the set and keyed the handset and said something like, "This is the new ranger, I just got in tonight." There was a pause, and then she said, "Welcome back, Ranger Adler, status nominal?" And I said, "No, I'm not Adler. Adler left. I'm the relief. My name's Daniel Whitaker." And there was another pause, shorter, and she said, "Of course, my mistake, Ranger Whitaker. Please confirm status nominal for the log." I said I was fine. Everything was nominal. And she thanked me and said her name was Marisol, that she'd be my contact every night at 3:14, and that all I ever had to do was confirm I was on station, and that my status was nominal. Then the radio clicked off and the hum stopped and the cabin was very quiet, and I lay in the dark thinking about how she'd called me Adler, and how easy it had been to correct her, and how I'd already half forgotten it by the time I fell back asleep. The first week I learned the routine, and the routine was good for me. I'm not too proud to say that. There's a kind of medicine in having simple things to do at fixed times. Each morning I checked the fuel levels in the generator shed and the propane on the range. I split wood, because the cabin ran on the stove and the nights were cold even in season. I walked the trail, which ran from the clearing out along the basin floor for about 6 miles to where it met the boundary of the reserve, and along it at intervals were mile marker boards, wooden posts with squares of cracked acrylic over notices, trail closures, weather warnings, the occasional faded missing person sheet for someone who'd wandered off years ago. I was supposed to check the boards, make sure the notices were current, replace anything water damaged. There was a laminating machine in the annex for exactly that, an old heavy thing on a metal table, and a stack of blank acrylic pouches beside it. I want to be precise about the laminator, because it matters. It was unplugged. I unplugged it myself after the first time I used it, because the cord was frayed near the plug and I didn't trust it on the cabin's wiring. And yet, starting around that first week, I kept catching a smell in the annex, and the smell was hot dust and a faint sharp tang underneath it, the exact smell that machine made when it warmed up. Ozone, almost. I'd walk into the back room to file a report, and there it would be, and I'd put my hand flat on the laminator's casing and it would be stone cold unplugged, The cord coiled where I'd left it. The first few times I figured it was a smell that had soaked into the room over the years. By the end of the week, I'd stopped being able to convince myself of that, but I still wasn't afraid. I want to be clear about the order of things. The fear came slowly, and it came through paper. It was on a trail check, I think the 8th or ninth day, that I found Adler's poster. It was on the board at mile marker 4, behind the cracked acrylic, and at first I thought it was just one of the old faded missing sheets I'd been told to leave alone. Then I looked at it properly. It wasn't faded. It was fresh, the colors still true, and the face on it was a man I'd never met but recognized anyway because his name was on a note in a coffee can on my porch. E. Adler. The poster had his photograph, the same kind of plain employee photograph that I knew was sitting in my own file somewhere, and it said missing and gave a date, and at the bottom there was a stamp in purple ink, 2 lines of text inside a box, and the text read, "Subject status, pending supersession." I stood there a long time. The thing that bothered me most wasn't even the word missing, though that bothered me plenty, because Adler wasn't missing. Adler had rotated out. The agency had told me so. The thing that bothered me was the format. The layout of that poster was identical to the layout of every internal form I'd seen in the cabin. Same font, same box for the photograph, same line for the date. It didn't look like something a worried family makes and tapes to a telephone pole. It looked like something an office prints. It looked official, the way a death certificate looks official. And that word, supersession, was a word I had never heard used about a person. I did the thing I would come to regret more than any other thing I did out there, though it seemed completely harmless at the time. I took out my phone, which had no signal but still worked as a camera, and I photographed the poster. I told myself I'd ask Marisol about it on the next check-in. I told myself it was probably some bureaucratic mix-up, that someone had filed Adler as missing by mistake when he was just late rotating out, and that I should document it so it could be corrected. Documenting things was my job. That's what I told myself. That night I asked Marisol about it, and she was warm and unbothered and said she'd look into it, and she said the word supersession the way you'd say a routine procedure, like reconciliation or inventory, and I let it go. But the poster had changed something in me, and I started reading the logbook properly. Not just the last few entries, but back, all the way back, and that was when I found the pattern, and the pattern is the thing that stopped me sleeping. The logbook went back almost 30 years. Different rangers, different handwriting, season after season, and every single one of them followed the same arc, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. A ranger would arrive. The early entries were always brisk and practical. Fuel checked. Trail clear. Replace notice at marker 2. Then, after some weeks, the entries would change. They'd start mentioning small, wrong things, almost in passing, the way you'd note a leak. Smelled the laminator again. Must be the wiring. Relay called me by the wrong name. Found my supply manifest listed for the previous ranger. And then the entries would get shorter and tighter, and the handwriting would get worse, more cramped, more pressed down, until near the end of each ranger's season the writing would loosen, suddenly, into something almost calm, and they'd write something like, "All good here," the exact words Adler had written, the exact words, and then the entries would simply stop, and a new hand would begin a few pages later, brisk and practical, with no mention of the person before. There was never a handoff, not once in 30 years. Each ranger ended mid-thought, and the next began as if the basin had always been empty and waiting. And there was something else in the logbook, tucked between 2 entries from a season I couldn't date because the ink had gone brown, written in a hand that was neither cramped nor practical, a loose, careless hand I almost knew. It said, "If a tree falls and nobody files it, did it ever stand?" I read that line and the cabin went cold around me because that was Theo's joke. That was a thing my brother used to say, his own stupid version of the old question, and he'd say it whenever I got too serious about paperwork or rules. If a tree falls and nobody files it. I had never written it down anywhere. I had never told anyone. And it was here, in a logbook in a cabin 4 hours from the nearest town, in a season that ended before Theo was old enough to make the joke. I checked the doorframe after that, because I'd started checking everything. Low down, near the floor, on the inside of the main cabin's door there were scratches. 7 of them, cut into the wood with something sharp, close together, the way a person counts days on a wall. I went out and checked the second cabin, the locked one, and found the same 7 scratches on its frame. I found them on the generator shed. 7, everywhere, like a tally that someone kept resetting. I should have left then. I know that. If I'm honest with the version of me that's recording this, I knew it then too. But leaving meant going back to the debt and the empty apartment and the open file with Theo's name on it, and it meant admitting I was the kind of man who fled the woods because of some scratches and a smell, and I had built my whole reason for being there on not being that man. So I stayed, and I told myself I was investigating, which is just a word people use when they want to keep walking toward the thing that's going to hurt them. 2 days later, the supply truck came, the only scheduled delivery of the month, and a man named Cole climbed out of it, and for a few hours I had another human being in the basin with me, and I felt almost sane. Cole was talkative the way men who drive alone all day get talkative when they finally have an audience. He helped me carry boxes into the cabin, and he knew my name. He called me Dan. He'd written it on his clipboard, and we drank coffee on the porch, and he told me about the road and the weather coming and the bears he'd seen lower down. When he left, he had me sign the delivery manifest, and I signed it. And as I did, I looked at the top of the page and saw that the manifest listed the rations as being for one ranger, and the name printed beside the ration count was not mine. It said, E. Adler. I almost said something to Cole, but he was already in the truck, and the boxes had my food in them, the right food, and I told myself it was a clerical thing, a template nobody had updated, and I waved him off down the fire road and watched the dust settle, and the basin was mine again, and quieter than before. That night, I made the decision to open the locked cabin. I want to walk you through how I got there, because I need you to understand it wasn't stupidity, even though it was the worst thing I did. I'd been telling myself the second cabin was a maintenance shed. But the padlock was on the outside, and the windows were papered from the inside, and Adler's poster was on the board, and my supply manifest had Adler's name on it, and there was a logbook full of rangers who ended mid-sentence. And somewhere in all of that, I had stopped being able to pretend that the locked cabin was nothing. I needed to know what was inside. Not because I was brave, because I am a man whose brother vanished into a silence so total that there was nothing for anyone to find, and I have spent every day since wishing I had been a witness, wishing there had been something to see, someone to look. And here was a locked door with my dead colleague's face on a missing poster 40 feet away, and I could not walk past it again. The wound made the choice. It always does. The keys in the coffee can opened it. Of course they did. The padlock that hadn't moved in years, by the dust, turned on the first try, and the hasp swung free, and I pulled the door open, and the smell came out at me. Hot dust and ozone, strong, the laminator smell. Except this room had no laminator that I could see at first. Inside, the papered windows let through a dim brown light. There were filing cabinets, 4 of them, gray metal, and a metal table, and on the table sat a laminating machine, the twin of the one in the annex, and it was warm. I put my hand on it before I'd thought about what that meant, and it was warm, the way a machine is warm when it's been running, and it was not plugged into anything. There was no outlet on that wall. There was no generator line to that cabin, and the casing was warm under my palm and the smell was rolling off it, and I took my hand back like I'd been burned even though I hadn't. The filing cabinets weren't locked. I opened the top drawer of the nearest one, and it was full of hanging folders, each with a tab, and each tab had a name and a date, and I recognized some of the names from the logbook. Rangers. Decades of them. I pulled one, and inside was a single laminated sheet, a missing poster, the face of a person I'd never met, the word missing, a date, and the purple stamp, subject status, pending supersession, except on the older ones a second stamp had been added beneath it, a darker stamp, and it said complete. I went through them with my hands shaking. Every ranger in that logbook had a folder. Every folder had a poster. The old ones said complete. And then I found the drawer that wasn't full, the working drawer, the one with only a few folders in it, and the frontmost folders tab had a date on it that was tomorrow's date, and below the date it had my name, Daniel Whitaker. I want to tell you I didn't open it. I opened it. Inside was my missing poster, the one I'm holding now, my employee photograph, laminated, the corners rounded by that machine, the word missing across the top, a case number, a line that said last seen, and the date on that line was that day's date, the day I was standing there reading it. There was a field for last known location, and it said Hollow Reach Relief Station. There was a field for reported by, and it was blank. There was the purple stamp pending supersession, and below it a checkbox, a small printed box on the laminated sheet, and inside the box was a mark, not a full check, but a single diagonal stroke, like the first half of a check that someone had started and not finished. and there was a signature line at the bottom, and on it, in pen, was a signature I couldn't read, a supervisor's signature, a name that started with a letter that could have been anything. I stood in that brown light holding my own missing poster, dated for a disappearance that hadn't happened yet, processed and filed and half checked off, and I understood for the first time, in my body, and not just my head, that I was not investigating anything. I was being processed. The basin wasn't a place where people went missing. It was a place that filed people away, that did the paperwork first and let reality catch up, and the paperwork on me was nearly done. I did the only thing my whole life had trained me to do. I tried to prove I existed. I took the poster. I'm not going to pretend I left it there. I took it because it was evidence, and evidence was the one thing my brother's case had never had. And I went back to the main cabin and I wrote in the logbook, in big firm letters, the truth. I wrote my name, the date, that I was alive and on station, that there was a poster of me in the locked cabin, that something was wrong. I wrote it the way you'd shout it. And then I went to the radio and I waited for 3:14, and when Marisol's voice came, I told her everything. I told her about the folders and the poster and the checkbox, and I said, I am here, I am alive, my name is Daniel Whitaker, are you writing that down? Write that down. And she said, in that same warm, even voice, of course, Ranger Whitaker, I have you on station. And then she said, just confirm status nominal and we'll log it. And something in me, some animal sense, refused. And I said, no, I'm not nominal, nothing is nominal. And there was a pause, and she said, that's all right, we can complete that later, we can complete that later. And the radio clicked off and I stood there with the word complete ringing in my ears, the same word stamped under the dark posters in the drawer. In the morning I went to read what I'd written in the logbook, to make sure it was still there, to look at the proof of my own shouting, and the entry was fading, not gone, fading. The ink had gone gray and thin overnight, the way ink goes after years, and the letters were softening at their edges, while the entries around mine, the old ones, the dead ranger's entries, stayed dark and sharp. My handwriting was the only thing on the page that was disappearing, and I understood then the worst thing about the place, the thing that makes it different from any horror you've heard, which is that every record I made of myself was being used against me. The poster fed on documentation. The checkbox advanced every time I confirmed a fact about myself. Writing my name in the log, radioing in my status, photographing the evidence, all of it was the machine completing its forms. The more I insisted I was real, the more thoroughly I was being filed. To fight it the way I knew how to fight, with records, with witnesses, with proof, was to help it. I went back to the locked cabin that day and I looked at my poster again, the one in my hands now, and the diagonal stroke in the checkbox was longer than it had been. I am sure of it. It had grown, the way the scratches on the doorframe had been 7, and were now, when I looked, 8. That night, Marisol's voice was the same as always, and it should have been a comfort, and it was the opposite, because she had stopped pretending in small ways. She referred to me in the past tense without seeming to notice she'd done it. She said something like, you always did good work on the boards, and I said, what do you mean did? I'm doing it now, and she went smoothly past it. And then she said the thing that broke whatever was left of my hope. She said, we're nearly finished completing Adler's file, and once that's done, we'll move on to yours. It won't take long. You've been very cooperative. Very cooperative. As if I had been helping all along. As if every report and confirmation and careful piece of evidence I'd produced had been exactly what she needed. And I realized that Marisol was not a cruel woman in an office somewhere. She was kind. Her kindness was the procedure. She was the warm voice the system used to keep its subjects calm and confirming their status right up until the box was checked. And she may not even have been a person anymore at all, may have been superseded herself decades ago, and kept on as a voice because a warm voice gets better compliance than a cold one. I have thought about that a great deal. The kindness was the worst part. It always is. The supply truck came back early. It wasn't scheduled for 3 more weeks, but I heard it on the fire road one afternoon and I ran out to meet it, because Cole was a living person who had written my name on his clipboard and called me Dan, and Cole was proof. The truck pulled into the clearing and Cole climbed out and looked at me with no recognition at all. None. He said, afternoon, you the new ranger? And I said, Cole, it's Dan. You were here 2 weeks ago. We had coffee. And he frowned, polite, the way you frown at a stranger who's claiming to know you, and he said, sorry, friend, I haven't run this route in a while. Station's been empty since Adler walked off. He said it like a fact. Everyone knew. Station's been empty since Adler walked off, and I looked at his clipboard while he was getting the boxes, and the delivery was logged to Hollow Reach Relief Station, 1 Ranger, and the name on the line was blank. Not Adler, not mine, blank. They'd stopped filling it in. There was no one to deliver to. He left the boxes because the route said to leave boxes, and he drove off without my signature because there was no one, in any way that his paperwork recognized, for him to get a signature from. I sat on the porch a long time after that. I want to be careful here, because this is the part where a man alone in the woods starts to wonder if he's gone insane, and I wondered it. I won't pretend I didn't. But the boxes were real, and the food in them was real, and the poster in my hands was real, and a hallucination doesn't hand a clipboard to a man who can't see you. Cole couldn't see me the way you can't see a name that's been erased from a form. I was still standing in the world physically, but I had been removed from the record of it, and Cole lived by the record. To the paperwork of the world, I was already gone, and Cole was a man who only knew what the paperwork told him. I spent the next days reading Adler's things, because Adler was the only one whose ending I could reconstruct, and because I needed to know if there was a way out or only a way through. His personal effects were in a footlocker under the bed in the main cabin, a spare uniform, a paperback with the cover torn off, a photograph of a woman and a dog, and a separate notebook, not the official logbook, a private one, where Adler had written the things he couldn't write in the log because the log was being read, and reading it was like reading my own days a few weeks ahead of myself. Adler had found his poster too. Adler had photographed it, had radioed it in, had shouted his name into the relay, had watched his own handwriting fade. Adler had figured out, as I had, that documentation fed the thing, and Adler had tried the opposite, had tried to stop making any record at all, had gone silent on the radio for 3 nights running, and Adler wrote that on the 3rd night of silence, the laminator in the locked cabin had run all night long on its own. He could hear it through the wall, warming and cooling and warming, like it was working overtime to make up for the records he was refusing to give it. And then Adler's private notebook ended the way the logbook always ended, mid-thought, a sentence that stopped, the pen trailing off the edge of the word, and the last words were, she said we could complete it later, and then nothing, and I knew where the rest of Adler was. The rest of Adler was on the board at mile marker 4, behind cracked acrylic, laminated, missing, and somewhere in those filing cabinets his folder now had a second stamp on it, the dark one, complete. That was when I understood that the relief rotation had never been a rotation. I hadn't been hired to cover for Adler. I'd been hired to replace him, in the way one form replaces another in a drawer. They didn't overlap our schedules because you can't hand off a station from one disappeared man to the next. The job had never been a job. It had been a sentence, and the sentence was being a name the basin could process, and they chose me. I am certain of this. They chose me because the application asked nothing and required nothing, and was made easy precisely because they were not looking for a ranger. They were looking for someone who would not be missed, someone whose disappearance would slide into the world without a ripple, a man with no one waiting on him, no overlapping shift, no one who'd raise the alarm, a man already half erased by his own grief and his own guilt and his own wish to vanish. I had practically advertised myself. And in the bottom of one of the filing cabinets, in a folder of basin-wide records, cross-references between stations, because Hollow Reach was not the only one, there were others, names of other stations in other dead-end valleys. I found a sheet listing supersessions completed across the whole reserve, by date, and I went down the list, the way you go down any list looking for a name you're afraid to find, and I found it, 18 months back, a station I'd never heard of, on the far side of the reserve, a day's drive from where my brother had parked his car at a trailhead and walked up a path and never come down. And the name on that line was Theo Whitaker. I have read that line 100 times in my memory since. Subject, Theo Whitaker. Status, complete. And everything I had believed about my brother turned over and showed me its other side. Theo had not wandered off the trail and died of exposure in some ravine they never searched. Theo had been superseded. Theo had been filed. And the reason they never found him, the reason there was nothing to find, no body, no campsite, no sign of which way he turned, the reason the case slid into a drawer and stopped being looked at, the reason people stopped saying his name, was not bad luck or a vast wilderness. It was that the basin had done to Theo exactly what it was doing to me. It had removed him from the record of the world so completely that the world simply forgot to keep asking. And the guilt I had carried for 18 months, the guilt of the skipped shift, of not being a witness, was a lie I had been telling myself, because there had never been anything to witness. No witness would have helped. The thing that took Theo doesn't leave a direction to point in. I sat with that for a long time, and grief is too small a word for what it was, because mixed into it was the other thing, the rotten thread, the relief I had felt when Theo vanished and the fight over the house went quiet. And now I understood that I had built a prison of guilt around an event that was never my fault, and that the basin had counted on exactly that, had counted on me being the kind of man who would walk into a place like this dragging a wound that made him slow to fight, easy to file, half wanting to go. And maybe Theo, wherever the record of him was kept, had been the same. Maybe we both had the same wound. Maybe that runs in a family. I knew by then that the only way out was the one Adler had been too far gone to take, and I want to explain why I think Adler failed, because it's the heart of everything. Adler tried to stop making records by going silent, but Adler had already made too many. He'd already shouted his name and filed his evidence and confirmed his status enough times that the box was nearly checked, and his 3 nights of silence couldn't undo what he'd given. And on the last night, when the laminator ran by itself, the system didn't need Adler's cooperation anymore. It had enough. It completed him without him. The lesson wasn't that silence saves you. The lesson was that silence has to come before the box is full, and you have to refuse the one confirmation that matters, and you have to leave before they decide they have enough to complete you without your help. I had one thing Adler didn't have, and it's a small, ugly thing, but it's the truth. I had been telling Marisol no. I had refused status nominal twice already. I had not given them the clean confirmation. The diagonal stroke in my checkbox had grown, but it was not a full check. The box was not finished. There was still a refusal in me that the paperwork couldn't get past, and I decided that the way out was not to make a louder record or a better record. The way out was to give them nothing more, to not be confirmed, to leave the radio silent on the one night they needed me to say I was fine, and to walk out of the basin on my own feet before the machine decided it had enough of me to finish the form alone. So I waited for 3:14, that last night, and I'll tell you what it was like, because it was the closest I have ever come to dying and there was no violence in it at all. The radio clicked at 3:14 and the hum came up, and Marisol's voice said, "Hollow reach, this is relay, confirming check-in." And I sat across the room from the handset, and I did not pick it up. She said it again. "Hollow reach, confirming check-in, please confirm status nominal." Her voice was warm. It was so warm. And through the wall, from the locked cabin 40 feet away, I heard the laminator start. The smell came first, hot dust and ozone, rolling into the main cabin under the door, and then the sound, a low warming hum, and then the cycle, warm and cool and warm, working, running on nothing, running on no power at all. And I understood it was doing what it had done on Adler's last night, working overtime to make up for the record I was refusing to give. Marisol kept her voice level. She said, "Ranger Whitaker, I have you on station. I just need you to confirm status nominal and we can complete your file. It's almost done. You've been so cooperative, it won't hurt. The others all say it doesn't hurt. The others all say." And I sat with my hand over my own mouth so I wouldn't answer, because every part of me trained to be a good employee, to confirm, to comply, to fill in the form when the form is held out to you, wanted to key that handset and say nominal, just to make the warm voice happy, just to stop the laminator running, just to be a man who did what he was told. That is the deepest trap of the place. It uses your decency. It uses the part of you that wants to cooperate, that doesn't want to be difficult, that has spent a whole life being told that the right thing is to fill in the box. And I sat there and I let her ask, and I gave her nothing, and the laminator ran, and at some point near dawn it slowed and stopped, and the smell faded, and Marisol's voice, for the first time in all our nights, lost its warmth. The last thing she said, flat now, almost puzzled, was, "You have to confirm. Everyone confirms." And then the radio clicked off, and it did not come back. I took my poster from the locked cabin, the one I'm holding, and I took Adler's private notebook, and I left everything else, my pack, my logbook, the food, all the records of myself, because I would not carry one more document of my own existence out of that place for it to use. I walked out of the main cabin into the gray morning, and as I passed the doorframe I looked down at the scratches out of habit, and there were 8 of them now, and as I watched, I swear to you, a ninth was being cut into the wood, slowly, from the inside, with no hand on it, the wood curling up in a thin, pale strip, and I did not stay to see it finished. I walked across the clearing and started down the fire road on foot, because I would not start the truck, because starting the truck would create a record, a vehicle log, a movement, a fact about Daniel Whitaker that the basin could file, and I had decided that, until I was clear of that place, I would be a man who made no record at all. I walked 6 miles of washouts and roots, and then more, and I did not look back at the 2 cabins, and the basin let me go, and I have wondered ever since whether it let me go because I'd beaten it or because, in the way that mattered to it, I was already gone and it had simply moved on to the next folder in the working drawer. It took me most of a day to reach a road with a signal, and that's where I started to understand the price of what I'd done. Because I had walked out of the basin, but the basin had already reached into the world ahead of me, and the world it gave me back was not the one I left. There was no record of my employment. I called the agency, the number from the email, and got a recording that the number was not in service. The email account that had sent me the roster bounced. There was no listing for a Hollow Reach relief station anywhere I could find, no record that anyone named E. Adler had ever worked for the reserve, no Marisol on any relay. My apartment, when I finally got back to the city, had been relet. The landlord, a man I'd paid rent to for 3 years, looked at me the way Cole had looked at me, polite and blank, and said the place had been empty when he leased it to the current tenant, that he didn't have any record of a Whitaker, and could I please stop coming around. My bank account was closed, not emptied, closed, as if it had never been opened. The debt that had ruled my life, the co-signed loan that had driven me into that basin, was gone too, no record of it, and you might think that would feel like freedom, and it felt like the opposite, because a man without debts and without an apartment and without an employer and without a bank is not a free man. He is a man who has been erased and is walking around in the leftover space where he used to be. And then I found the last thing, and it's the thing that tells me I did not beat the basin at all, that there is no beating it, only walking out of the building while the form sits unfinished on the desk. I went to look up my brother's case, Theo's open case, the file I had checked obsessively for 18 months, and there, in the same system, I found a second open missing person report, filed 18 months ago, the same week as Theo's, and the subject of that report was me, Daniel Whitaker. Reported missing 18 months before I ever drove out to Hollow Reach. Last seen, the report said, on the same trail where my brother vanished, as if I had gone with him after all, as if the witness I always wished I'd been was a witness who disappeared alongside the thing he came to witness. The report was 18 months old, which means I was filed as missing before I took the job. The basin had not processed me during that season in the woods. It had processed me the day my brother walked up that trail, and everything since, the debt, the easy application, the empty roster with my name on it, the drive out, the locked cabin, all of it had been the slow completion of a form, started a year and a half before I knew the form existed. I did not stumble into Hollow Reach. I had been pending the whole time. The job was the basin reaching out to retrieve a folder it had opened long ago and never quite closed. I don't know what's behind the inner door of the locked cabin. I never opened it. There was an inner door, in the back of that papered room, behind the filing cabinets, a low door I hadn't mentioned because I'm only now able to say it, and I never opened it, and the one thing I am certain of is that it was being filled. I could hear it, on the quiet nights, a sound like paper settling, like a drawer that's too full being pressed shut, and behind that low door, getting fuller. That's where the Rangers go. That's where Adler is, and the others, 30 years of them, and that, I think, is where my brother is, in some other valley behind some other low door, filed and complete, and where I would be if I had said one word into that radio on the last night. Nominal. That's all it would have taken. One word that means everything is fine, the most ordinary word in the world. So here is why I'm recording this, and why I'm giving it to you, instead of writing it down, instead of filing it anywhere, instead of making it a document, because every record I made of myself out there fed the thing that was erasing me. The logbook, the radio, the photographs, all of it was a confirmation, and confirmations are what it eats. But this is not a form. This is a voice, given to other voices, passed along, unfiled, uncatalogued, with no box to check and no stamp to apply. I am hoping that a story is the one kind of record the basin can't supersede, because a story doesn't live in a drawer. It lives in the people who heard it. And you can't laminate a thing that's in 100 different heads at once. That's my whole theory. It might be wrong. It's all I have. I'm asking you to remember my name, Daniel Whitaker. I'm asking you to remember that there was a man who took a job in a basin so far back the road just stops, and that the job was a sentence, and that he walked out of it on foot down a washed-out road and into a world that had already forgotten him. Remember that his brother's name was Theo, and that Theo's case is still open in a drawer somewhere, not because the wilderness is large, but because something filed him away and counted on no one asking. Keep asking. That's the only thing that doesn't feed it. Asking. I have the poster here. My face, laminated, dated for a day that's already passed, the checkbox still showing that single unfinished stroke. As long as that stroke stays unfinished, I think, I'm still here. In whatever way I'm still here. I look at it more than I should, and lately, when I look at it, I have a thought I can't shake, and it's the thought I'll leave you with, because it's the last true thing I know. I look at the name printed under the photograph, Daniel Whitaker, and I find that I can no longer be completely certain it was ever mine. I remember being him. I remember Theo and the house and the debt and the drive out, but memory is just another kind of record, and I have learned what that place does to records. And some nights when I say my own name out loud, it sounds like a name I borrowed from a folder, a name I confirmed too many times into a warm voice in the dark. So remember it for me, please, because I'm not sure how much longer I can.